Good afternoon, I'm Jordan Roth, and thank you for joining us today for episode 23 of DALLÄSTHETIC. I'm without my glasses today because, as I noticed a little bit earlier, there's quite a glare on this pair, and I thought I could save you from that. Also, saving my guest today from the flu that I had earlier this week. Get your flu shots next year, if you do that. Not everyone does. This was the first year that I went without a flu shot, and I was just down and out for too long. But now everything's great. We're about to open an exhibition for Hayley Quentin and another one for Candace Hicks at our gallery in the Cedars. Behind us is the image from Tender Care Detention, Angel Cabrales' third iteration of It Came From Beyond the Border, and that's at the Ro2 Art pop-up at downtown 1508 Commerce. Do check that out before that's over. There will be an art talk there on February 23rd, that's next Saturday, at 5 p.m. Angel will discuss the work in the show, and we'll likely handle some questions that have come up from the Latinx community in recent weeks. So back to the present. I'm here with Hayley Quentin.
Hey.
Hey, so you're joining us from California.
Yeah, from LA.
From LA. And is this your first time in Dallas?
No, it came once before,
yeah.
For last spring sideshow.
Right, that's true. How could I forget? That's how I know you.
Yeah.
So, what's the weather like in California these days?
Do you know what? It's warmer here today than it is in LA. It's raining in LA
right
now, which is, of course, on the news. It's newsworthy when it rains there.
Yeah, it would be. Mm-hmm. Well, you got here right about exactly the right time because the weather's been pretty crappy up until today.
Did you get the polar vortex?
We got something. I don't know. I didn't like it.
Yeah.
So you've lived in California for some time now.
Yeah, I was born in LA, lived there my whole life, but I did spend some years living abroad in the UK and in France for a bit, and then I moved back to LA 2 and a bit years ago. Oh, almost 3.
Wow.
Yeah.
And well, tell me, when did you start painting?
Painting specifically, I don't have an exact memory of when, but I was always making art, specifically drawing. Even when I was really, really young, I have drawings that I did, before kindergarten, things like that. And I was always interested in working with the figure. Like all the drawings that I have from when I was a kid, they're always of people. And they're always like drawings of naked people.
Yeah.
Weird kid. So yeah, I was always interested in art, always knew that I wanted to do art and study art, and was lucky to have the privilege to do so. So it's just been a part of my identity as long as I can remember.
That's true. Were your parents hippies?
Yes.
That might be why the people were all naked.
Maybe. I just have all these memories of being really young and always being interested in the body. Like, in the Jungle Book,
mm-hmm.
Like I always liked the drawings of the people, but also the animals. And I remember, what's the name of the panther?
Oh, I don't remember.
Bagheera, maybe?
Yeah, I think so.
And when he's like slinking on the branch of the tree, you can see like the shoulder blades.
Oh, yeah.
The scapula. And I was thinking like, oh, people have shoulders. And so I actually changed, and I don't know how old I was then, really little. I changed how I was drawing people from that memory.
Wow.
Or like, I remember watching in kindergarten, I remember watching the Snowman. It's like a silent animated, which I found out later was British and set in Brighton, which is where near where my now husband is from, which is wild. But when the kid is sleeping, like the hands, they are relaxed like this, and he doesn't smile when he sleeps. And I have this distinct memory of thinking, that's how you draw people when they're sleeping. They're not stiff and rigid and smiling, because I had done that.
Yeah.
And I have these memories of like looking at bodies, and especially drawings of people, and that changing how I then did my own drawings. So I think there's just something that clicks in my brain about people and particularly faces and how bodies look. And yeah, I don't know, I'm just drawn to it.
Do you I sometimes ask this question. Do you ever develop kind of a dialogue, or maybe not a dialogue, but a relationship with the subject?
How do you mean? Like,
As they're developing, do you feel like you get to know them better?
it's interesting. When I'm working in my practice now, when I'm creating a painting, I don't feel like it's a separate person. I feel like I have ownership of the image that I'm working on, and that it is not the person. That it is, because it's all the paintings that I make now. They're based on photographs that I take of people that I know, and going over the same, like doing multiple works from the same person. But when it's a painting, it's not that person.
Right.
It's like
yeah.
Something that I've created, and so I feel ownership over this object now that is separate from the person. But a lot of people do wonder about like my relationship to the subject, and yeah, for me, I kind of forget that it's even another person, so to speak, which I think maybe is like perhaps how like doctors or other people feel when they're working with bodies, like they perhaps
Right.
forget it's another person, because I'm studying the way that the lines and the shapes and the planes of light hit the face or the body, or what colors I would use, and I think that I have ownership over that thing.
And when did you ever paint women?
When I was really young, I did, and I think this has a lot to do with what is accessible to young people who want to be artists. I mean, I can't say for anything other than my own experience, which is growing up in a specific place of the world at a specific time period. Maybe it's different for people who live in other places and in other time periods, but probably pretty similar, which is what you see all the time in art history or in art, or even in culture, contemporary culture, is like lots of young women depicted like over and over, whether that's advertising or even in art. So what you think of as a young person who wants to make art is like, oh, especially as I was in high school, let's say, that's how I make artwork, is depicting like young women, and doing lots of, so I would do a lot of paintings of portraiture of women, and of other bodies of women. But I remember one time I did a drawing, I think it was a drawing, it might have been a painting of a man, and I remember getting, how subconscious you are
Yeah.
as a high schooler, like, oh, you painted a man, you painted a guy, and I felt really embarrassed, and so I felt almost shamed in a way, which is because you feel so judged at that age anyways. Right. And so I didn't do it for a long time until I was at college when I went to Otis, and I realized this is kind of how I see the world. I really want to do paintings of men. That's what's the most interesting to me, what I'm constantly drawn to. And, I didn't have enough resources as a young person to see that depiction for myself. And so it was sort of like I had to accept that that's how I wanted to do things. Like that's what I wanted, that's the kind of artist I wanted to be. And I didn't feel that I almost had the ability to do that, or even the language to articulate that that's what I wanted to do, until I was at Otis and I was in that space where I could, learn about what I wanted to learn and figure out like, how do I see the world? What kind of artist am I?
Yeah.
So it was really like formative for me and the artist that I am today, because I really started painting men in college.
It makes sense that you didn't have reference material or really much of an impetus or like anything to guide you in painting men.
Yeah.
I've done a little bit of research here and there, and I've always heard these terms about the male gaze, over and over again. And I guess that wasn't even coined until the mid-'70s, the term, but it had been kind of the way that art and film and culture has been kind of coming at us, is from this male gaze,
Right.
which is really tricky. And it's not only the gaze of the creator, but the gaze of like the protagonist, who's usually male,
or assumed audience.
Yeah. And and when it's of a woman, there's no point of view at all.
Yeah.
Look at Renoir's paintings.
Yeah.
They're just as blank as they could possibly be. And then in advertising and things like that.
Yeah, I feel like one thing that really stuck with me a lot was in college, like, you know, everyone has to read Berger, like, and like I'm pretty sure it's chapter 3. I'm pretty sure that's what it is because it's ingrained in my mind. Just reading chapter 3, and it was so well articulated, the differences between how men are depicted and how that sort of like changes how they act, and how women are depicted, especially throughout art history and in advertising, and how for women you always are constantly thinking about yourself through the eyes of others, like literally how you are looked upon or gazed upon, right? And it just was so it was so important for me to read that and to think about like how I wanted to proceed as an artist, and how I wanted to, like, I didn't want to be the subject, you know, I wanted to be the creator, you know, and that's still like how I feel, you know, I you know, there's like hashtag girl gaze and all of that, and it's like, yeah, you can have your gaze too, as long as it's like refracted like right back onto yourself, like onto other women or your own, or like self-portraiture. And I'd want to make the distinction, like I do think that's different than equal representation,
right?
Because equal representation is super important, like, and representation of different people has different meanings for those people, and so it is important to have constant like equal representation. But that also means you have to have like equal creators too, and to have a voice that's heard. So when I was younger and I was looking at a lot of depictions of the male nude in art, often it was seen through like a very like homoerotic viewpoint, which, you know, I wasn't mad at it, but I wanted to also have my voice too, and to think about like how do we look at men, like how do women look at men, and then like separate from a demographic, how do I look at men, like what is it, you know, because for me the paintings are not just like a political statement, it's like deeply personal. So certain aspects of the body that I'll focus on, I think maybe there's some relative universality of how women look at men, that they find those certain things attractive. Like, for example, I focus a lot on hands, right? So of course this is in a way like a signifier of the audience, you know, the touch of, you know, the body, and it's like the viewer's hand in a way, but it's also a part of the body that I find very attractive, and you get that feeling when you look at it of like the sound of the touch, right? And how it would feel on the body, and like where on the body is the hand. And then I direct the viewer's eye with the colors that I use, or the saturation or the desaturation. So having these really intensely red hands, you know, which is usually like a sexualized color. For me, like allowing the viewer's eye to dance, you know, through the painting and direct where they look is important to me. And I think just having my singular viewpoint is like a door opening for other people to be creators who don't usually have their voice heard.
Yeah. And I watched a recent, I don't know how recent the presentation was, but I watched a presentation by a woman named Jill Soloway. She's a filmmaker, and I think she's maybe taking credit for female gaze. Or one of some people that might be taking credit for female gaze. And she said that she thought, you know, it was comprised of a few different things, but you take the cisgendered male out of the equation altogether. So you don't think about how they would view something. You don't depict them. They're not part of it unless they happen to be part of, say, the film crew, for instance. But even then, they have to step out of that role and, you know, imagine the subject and how the subject is feeling. And if the subject is moving, they have to, you know, feel like they're moving, or something along those lines. And it was an interesting topic. She also spoke about the difference between, you know, the equal access and different points of view. And it's the point of view that is so important because, if I think of maybe something that was erotic, an erotic image of a man early on might be the statue of David, but that's still from the point of view of probably a homosexual man.
Yeah, but I definitely enjoyed looking at those things, when I was learning about art, and even just as a person, I always felt like I really enjoyed looking at bodies, and because there weren't many women creating depictions of men, I would often see depictions of men created by men.
Yeah.
And I still found those appealing, and especially like David. I mean, think about like the largeness of the hands and the beauty of the placement of the fingers. Those little details are something that I was always drawn to. And I also think sculptures like that, they have this undescribable, really like inarticulable way of placing the body. Like, yes, it's the perfect contrapposto, but there's something about like when you see certain lines come together on the figure, they become more than the sum of their parts, right? It's something that is really hard to describe, and I'm always kind of searching for that element when I'm working with the figure, for that moment where it just sings and something happens beyond just the simple elements of line and form and value and color, that I was really drawn to with those depictions of men, even if they weren't created by women.
Yeah. I mean, and of course that one could almost as easily have been created by a woman, because it does, although he has just won a battle, you'd never get that from that image.
Yeah, I think the ideas of masculinity and sexuality, I mean, of course, change depending on the era, and now what we think of as like masculine, and those depictions of masculinity of like winning a battle would look really differently than the idea of David now.
Well, and our contemporary warriors are, oh gosh, I mean, it's just not the same thing as it was in the Roman times.
Yeah.
And it's tragic, and we think of people coming home from battle and being vulnerable.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, also I feel like there's a difference between like the reality and then like the fantasy or like the legend of something too. And you can romanticize. I mean, we still have like the reality of, I can't say to know anything about the reality of war or battle or anything like that, but there are still like myths or legends or idealizations of the hero in battle, and like, even not so long ago, and that's super different. But I really enjoy those kind of like false depictions that glorify something in a way that is for the pleasure of looking. Yeah. Like David, as opposed to like the reality is not pleasant, Yeah,
yeah. And yours tend to be, I think, what I get from it is definitely for your pleasure, if that doesn't sound weird, but no, I mean,
it's true.
I can tell that in these images, and we'll start to show them soon, but in the images that you create, you really do enjoy seeing these men through to a point of I guess softness and vulnerability, and kind of like seeing into them almost.
I really like the idea of vulnerability. I think looking at someone and enjoying looking at someone makes the other person vulnerable. And I really want to have that vulnerability in the paintings, for reasons of like it's appealing to me aesthetically, but also to have an alternative viewpoint of male depictions in contemporary art or just in the world in general is also important to me. I think there is something about that pleasure in looking at something that for me is really linked to the pleasure of actually painting the body. So it's not just that it's any representation of any male body, is the fact that it's specifically a painting, as opposed to a photograph or an advertising image or an illustration, or, I mean, cutting hairs, but you can think about like when you see the body and there's this visceralness, and it's the same with the texture of the paint, you know, the like sitting and spending, you know, the time, and you're mixing all of the paint and loading the paint onto the brush. Like, that is such a pleasurable experience, the act of painting. And I want that to resonate when the viewer looks at the painted body, and then they also gain the pleasure of looking at the painting, and that's,
Right.
you know, coupled with the pleasure of the act of painting. I mean, there's only you can't have control over how the viewer feels, but I hope that some aspect of the way that the act of painting happens is reflected onto the act of pleasure of looking at this painted body.
I mean, there is a meatiness, or at least a fleshiness to painting.
Yeah.
And
Do you ever like see paint and you want to eat it?
oh yeah, yeah. And I'm not a painter myself, but
Right.
but I do occasionally.
Yeah.
I'm sure you encounter that a lot.
Yeah, I think. Well, I mean, not like I would never eat it.
Right.
It's like pica, right? Isn't that what it's
Yeah,
called?
yeah.
But
pica.
sometimes when I see like the mixed paint, and especially the colors that I use, I just feel like it would taste really good.
Well, and like a makeup artist would, you know, apply, you know, makeup to the skin, and it
Yeah.
ends up being just exactly the way they wanted it to be.
Yeah.
To a degree, you're doing that when you're painting, because you've got this image in your head, and you're applying these layers, and then it's just right there in front of you.
Yeah, I mean, in my process, I do work from photographs. So I take photographs of people that I know, and in the studio, I work from those photographs.
Yeah.
But the photos aren't edited. They're
Yeah.
not. They don't have any color manipulation to what the colors of the final piece are going to be. Sometimes the photos are black and white, and they're not even good printouts. They're just crappy whatever printer printouts. And for me, the photograph is really just a jumping off point, and all the color application is like an experiment for each piece and each body. And I really try to like listen to the painting and let
Yeah.
it tell me like where it wants to go. And if I try and fight that and control what happens, the painting doesn't work. And if I just try and go a little bit slower and really look at the, you know, like when I'm mixing colors, I call it like a fact-finding mission, because
Yeah.
like I'm just trying to figure out what's going to work. So I'll have a huge palette set up, and I'll have all my colors out, and I'll just do a few little tests, you know, and see what's working together. And then as I'm working on the figure, and I'm going in that, and I see like where it's going to go, you know,
Yeah.
and I see what I want it to be, and I have that immediate feedback on the canvas, then I know that it's cohesive and it's working, and it's all coming together and going in the right direction. So I don't have that before I start the piece. I know some artists do work that way, where they have like the whole, especially if they work with unconventional color in any aspect, that they might, you know, manipulate a resource or a reference beforehand. And I have tried working that way, and I just ended up feeling a little, I don't know, like replicating.
Yeah.
So I like having that experiment with the paint, and the joy of finding the right path for that piece.
So will you mix sometimes a couple different options that you might go with? Oh, really?
Especially in the beginning, yeah. I'll mix. I'm just mixing and figuring out. Like I have certain things that, you know, I definitely have a palette that I like to work with. Like in those sentences in the beginning, you know, like quinacridone red is fab. I love quinacridone red. It's a really nice, cool toned red that when you mix it with white, gives you this searing, cool pink that is so like undeniable. You can't not look at it.
Right.
And then I don't use greens. You know, I find that yes, you can find greens in the body, because I'm using all colors really that you see in the body. But I find that for me, working within these like blues and reds and then some yellows or oranges is right where I'm happy with how I want to depict the body. Very influenced, you know, if I can say, by like Turner's color palette.
Oh.
So there's like color, like he doesn't use that much green. Like he did
No.
use some, but especially in the later work, like also he's so I mean, of course, everyone knows he's amazing, but
Yeah.
he was really ahead of his time because he was really using those oceans as an excuse to paint. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
You know, he's just trying to be an abstract painter.
Yeah.
And his paintings too, if I remember correctly, they inspired Ruskin to think about hanging art differently, right? From salon style to the like all in a line. And for me, I was like, yes, that really means he was ahead of his time. And I just really, I don't know, like it really spoke to me when I was a student and has still influenced me. And, you know, and I was so lucky to live in London for so long that I could see a lot of his pieces at the, you know, at Tate. And I really, like, unbelievably lucky that I got to do that, because the way he uses paint and luminosity and it is like endlessly inspiring to me.
A really monumental Turner exhibition came to Dallas about 15 years ago.
Oh, really? That's
and
awesome.
I went with my mom, actually. And
fab.
it was massive. I mean, it went from the beginning where he's doing classical, you know, paintings of statues and things like that, to the ocean scenes, which were displayed, you know, with space, but tons of them in one hall after the next. And I remembered walking through with my mom, and both of us were just saying, he was so far ahead of his time.
Yeah.
Just wow.
Yeah.
I mean, this is like color field. This is like, I mean, it was mind-boggling.
I know, he's amazing.
I mean, just amazing. Yeah. So it's interesting, you know, you have figurative paintings, and by the way, figurative art is back.
I know. Even when I was in school, though, I still felt a little like, oh, I'm doing these like kitschy figures, even though I wasn't, you know, like even that was like 10 years ago. But even then I would sort of feel like, oh, do you remember like that time? Yeah, it was about like 10 or so years ago, even earlier, where I was really in to be very ironic, like to not have anything where you're vulnerable. And that's right when I was in school.
Oh, wow.
So, and I was like being really vulnerable by painting these men and feeling like a little bit of a weirdo. And I was like, but that's really like how I see things. And I just want to try and like lay my whole self right out. And this is a part of me as a creator, and this is what's in my brain and how I see things. But it was the opposite of that sort of irony and that you know, like, you know, whatever, the absurd. Anyways, and so I did feel a little like, oh, I'm so like lame or what. But if you make something that's really authentic and like true to yourself, and you're not trying to worry about trends or anything, I feel like there's something that comes across in the work that is lasting and enduring.
Oh, for sure.
And maybe even endearing too.
Yeah, well, definitely endearing.
I hope. Like I just gave myself all those compliments.
I would say for sure. I don't know. Have any of the images come through? Some of these will flash through, but you know, it's great. You know, they are figurative, but they're just also love letters to painting itself.
Yes,
and to
sure.
color.
I love how you phrase that, love letters to painting. I think that's beautiful.
And to color and to light and composition and shape and I mean everything. They're like perfect paintings, and they just happen to be of these men.
Yeah. Well, I really want that beauty that I see when I look at men, and that pleasure that I get. Like I have to work really hard. Like I can't. I feel that at least not now, that I can't make a painting that won't entice a viewer, because I'm already facing an uphill battle. You know, it's like, please look at these naked men, please look at these dicks. You know, if you just say that verbally, you know, it's like, no thanks.
Yeah.
So I feel like I have to make something that's so beautiful, that's so intriguing, so pleasurable, so enticing, that the viewer can't look away. That they're almost sort of like led somewhere that they didn't know they wanted to go, but once they're there, they're in sort of visual ecstasy, you know. And you'll have a viewer that's maybe looking really close to the surface of a painting, and there's like a dick right there, but it's not like nudity, because often male nudity is like either a joke or aggressive or intentionally hideous, as though that somehow like proves that male beauty doesn't exist, or just taking that power away from people who want to look at men for pleasure. And so like if I make something that does look that beautiful, but it's sort of like for a subject that maybe you're a little uncomfortable with, it might lead you to question why you were uncomfortable in the first place. You know, all these kind of of reasons that we think of women as beautiful, or they have been the subjects of, you know, how we depict beauty and vanity or whatever, is because it's a very specific type of woman that's depicted all the time, and that's the standard of beauty. But a lot of those tropes can be applied to men, and you can realize how, like, there's no real reason that we have to associate those with one sex or one gender versus another. And so applying some of those in another way, hopefully, is leading to that kind of questioning of that status quo.
Yeah, and I feel like to a degree for men, I would see them as probably being somewhat aspirational in that, I mean, I haven't been that thin as most of your models in quite some time. But like, I want to feel the way that they feel, you know?
Well, I feel like for me, it's like that joy of looking at something, that pleasure in looking, and feeling that when the viewer looks at the piece too, you know?
Yeah.
And I mean, and a lot of women have to feel that way all the time for everything. And it's super like annoying and frustrating and difficult and hard. And I feel like if you just revert, like, that's why, you know, this idea, like, people saying things like, but like, women are inherently beautiful and men are not, and that's literally an opinion. Like, to have the confidence to have your opinion be stated as fact is amazing, but it's literally an opinion, and it's because you're looking at women that fall into these like very narrow confines of like what's considered beautiful, or the, you know, the status quo of representation. And it's like, if you apply those really narrow standards, you know, to anyone else, that same thing can happen.
Oh, yeah.
And for me, it's like a doorway into a stepping stone of like, you know, I think all people do want to be just multifaceted individuals. Like, everyone wants to be objectified sometimes, but everyone also wants to be seen as an intellectual person, as, you know, a happy person, as someone who can go through trauma, as someone who can go through joy, and doesn't always want to have to fit into this narrow confines. So it just is like a doorway of being like, you know, if we just like reverse one small gender role of like artist subject, one little drop in the ocean the other way, you know. And like, I don't even think these paintings are challenging, right? Like, I'm trying to make them beautiful so that it will entice people, but just like one little switch can like lead to a bigger conversation about who's depicted, who has the access and the ability to make art. You know, I don't know. Hopefully, that's the in a really positive, like, when I'm thinking really positively, like what I hope my work can do is lead to maybe some kind of change. That's like that's the dream.
Well, you're on your way, and they are gorgeous paintings.
Thank you.
And without a question, very successful. And I think I'm looking forward to the people of Dallas coming and seeing the paintings, and look forward to helping place them in collections here as well.
Yeah, I've just felt so welcomed here in Dallas, and I'm so happy to be here and really excited.
Well, we're thrilled. So with that, I hope that our audience will join us at the exhibition. It opens on Saturday, the 16th, from 7 to 10. We sometimes stay a little bit later. And it will run through March the 15th. And like I said, Ro2 Art in the Cedars, 1501 South Hervé Street. And we look forward to seeing you. Hayley Quentin, thank you so much for joining. It was a great conversation.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Whatever.